We keep hearing how strong the economy is, especially the labor market. Yet at the same time, we keep hearing from regular people who just don't feel it. Instead, they feel that their standard of living is slipping away, under threat from unknown forces. Yet those forces aren't unknown. People just don't know what they are. We even have a whole bunch of numbers that show these people are right. America's standard of living has been sharply deteriorated, and it's only gotten worse since 2020. And while that has gone on, stocks and financial assets have absolutely soared. The financial economy is booming, the real economy, not so much. Every time you hear some high political official talk about the strong and resilient economy, ask them which one they're referring to and watch what expression they give you. Why do crypto bros get to drive around in their third Lambo at the same time millions upon millions of regular workers are wondering what they're going to have to cut back on and give up next? They're hiding the truth from you for what are obvious reasons, especially once you see it. But how do we define standard of living? There's any number of ways to do it, and it's more of a ephemeral concept than it is some kind of tangible, quantifiable factor. But there are some ways in which we can measure it. In fact, there's some concrete ways in which we can measure it. Here, let's go to the Boston Federal Reserve. For most of us, standard of living is a know it when I see it concept. We might not be able to express it in precise terms, but we think we know it when we see it. Ask us to define it, we'll reel off a list of things we associate with living well. A nice car, a pleasant place to live, clothes, furniture, appliances, food, vacations, maybe even education. Ask us to measure it, and we'll probably look at whether or not we're doing better than our parents. Yet there is a generally accepted measure of standard of living, average real gross domestic product per capita. In effect, we take the value of goods and services produced within a country's borders, adjust for inflation, and divide by the total population. If average GDP per capita is increasing, there's a strong likelihood that A, more goods and services are available to consumers, and B, consumers are in a better position to buy them. And while buying more things won't necessarily help us find true happiness, true love, or true enlightenment, it is a pretty good indicator of our material standard of living. So real GDP per capita, and the Boston Fed author here is absolutely right. Because standard of living is not something you can put your finger on, but you kind of do feel it when things aren't going in the way that they should, especially over the long run period. We think about it as, are our lives getting better than our parents were? But the standard for standard of living isn't necessarily whether or not real GDP per capita is rising, but at what rate. That's the thing that we always miss. Because when you line up real GDP per capita on a chart, what you see is that it looks perfectly fine. It's rising. The numbers go from the bottom left to the upper right and seem to be hitting new highs all the time. But when you compare the trend, what you see is what we continue to see all over the place. There is a very substantial and very obvious deviation in trend in 2008. The trend had been basically constant from the beginning of the data back in 1947 all the way through to 2008. Recessions came and recessions went because recessions were actually recession before 2008. That meant a temporary deviation in trend, but after the recession was over, we actually recover and get right back on trend. And there are some periods where we're above trend and some periods where we're a little bit behind trend, but we're always right around that same trend. We're talking 60 years of economic history and consistency, rising living standards that we could all feel, perceive, and see, all captured in this one number. But what this one number tells us is that even though GDP per capita has been rising since 2008, it has been rising in a very, very different way, far slower. The rate of change is absolutely fallen way off. And when we actually put the numbers behind it, it really is a stark difference. By the second quarter of 2011, the GDP per capita, real GDP per capita in the US was about 90% of what its trend said it should have been. So we're off by 10% just by 2011, which is because of the so-called Great Recession. That was such a substantial contraction, it pushed output way, way down. And of course, unemployment, as we'll get to in just a moment. By the fourth quarter of 2019, so by the end of the decade, despite the fact that everyone has declared a recovery, the Federal Reserve said that labor shortage is leading to inflation. Various presidential administrations, doesn't matter what party, this is bipartisan failure. Everyone says the economy's doing just great by the fourth quarter of 2019. And guess what? We're only about 87.5% of trend. So we actually got further behind by the end of the decade than when we started it in the aftermath of the not recession of 2008. So we're already off by 12.5% before we get hit by the overreactions to the pandemic. And so as of the latest data, the first quarter of 2024, real GDP per capita, it's higher, but it's only 85.4% of that same trend. That same 60-year trend that held no matter what, through recessions, through booms and busts and everything else in between, through the great inflation. It didn't matter. The trend held until 2008. And now we're 85.4% of that trend. We're further behind in the first quarter of 2024 than we were in the fourth quarter of 2019, let alone any of the years before then. We keep getting further and further from that trend, which actually means even though GDP per capita is rising, we are getting further and further behind. Are our lives improving compared to our parents and grandparents? Yeah, but very, very slowly. And that very, very slowly makes an enormous difference. And that enormous difference is exactly what we can feel. Remember what the Boston Fed wrote. They said if the average real GDP per capita is increasing, there's a strong likelihood that more goods and services are available to consumers and that consumers are in a better position to buy them. So if real GDP per capita is rising at a far slower rate, then it means that not as many goods and services are available to consumers as they have come to expect, or even in real terms, in reality, in absolute terms, and that consumers may not actually be in a better position to buy them. More goods and services come available, but they're only available to a smaller and smaller portion of the population, which is why crypto bros get to buy Lamborghinis, and regular working folks are wondering if they have to eat ramen noodles for the next couple months and borrow so much just to pay the rent. When the real GDP per capita, or just the economy and output in general, are rising at a much slower rate, that means it works for less and less people. And the more people work in that economy, the more they have to work just to keep up. We are falling behind. Living standards are decaying right before our eyes. And one of the ways that we can absolutely see this is in income. Because that's really the key here. That's the one between more goods and services are available and consumers are in better position to buy them. Income means that producers are going to produce based on what their consumers can consume, and consumers are going to buy based on what income they have available. But look at real personal income excluding transfer receipt. We're going to take the government out of this. By the second quarter of 2011, total aggregate income for mostly earned as well as business purposes was already 1.6 trillion behind the prior trend. And that trend had been going back several decades too. So 1.6 trillion in less income by the middle of 2011, Eurodollar number 2. And by the time we get to the end of 2019, we're even further behind than in real GDP per capita. Now we're 2.8 trillion in income behind. That's by the end of the decade. Then along comes the overreaction to the pandemic, and first quarter of 2024, real incomes are now behind by 4.1 trillion. That's a staggering amount. Can you imagine what the world would be like if the US labor market actually generated as much income as the prior trend said it should? 4.1 trillion in more income would cure a whole bunch of problems. I can assure you of that. How much is that for the average worker? Well, if you just do some rough arithmetic, it works out to about 25,000 per average worker. But that doesn't mean that the average worker would be making 25,000 more had we stayed on trend. What it actually means is that there are so many fewer workers working that income has declined on average by about $25,000. Not from where incomes had been, but from where income should be. We've lost an enormous amount of employment. And that's the part that really gets me going, especially when we talk about the strong labor market. 4.1 trillion in missing income. That is not a strong labor market. But we can put numbers on the employment side as well. Doing the same calculations, coming up with a baseline and seeing where we are behind, seeing where we are compared to the trend. And yes, it is behind. Using the establishment survey. And the baseline for the establishment survey, because of other factors, not just economic factors, it's not as clear as it is, for example, for real GDP per capita, but it's still, for our purposes here, it's a rough enough guideline that we can use it to make these determinations. Again, showing how much the deflationary conditions in 2008 led to the same deflationary consequences that we see across economies in history. The labor market suffers for the deflation. And by deflation, I mean the breakdown in the monetary system that led to a massive and permanent breakdown in the real economy. Despite the claims that we recovered by the end of 2019, and this is the establishment survey, which is by far the most charitable look at the labor market. And then get this. And just considering the 2010s trend, not even going back to that pre-2008 trend, if we had stayed on the same trend of the 2010s as if there wouldn't have been a pandemic, what that means is there should have been 10.6 million more payrolls from the end of 2019. So over the 3+ years since the end of 2019, that should work out to about 10.6 million additional payroll gains. Instead, we've only had 6.5 million, which means we're about 4 million short of the 2010s trend. The labor market isn't strong. We get further and further behind. These deficits continue to pile up, and that's why the income is so much less than it really needs to be. And the picture from the household survey is, of course, even worse. But since 2019, there should have been 10 million more employed in the US when there have only been, hold on, brace yourself, 2.6 million more. So according to the household survey, there's only 2.6 million more employed in the US despite the 3.5 years since then, or three and a third years since then, when there should have been 10 million more. This argument about creation of jobs by whichever administration is complete nonsense. We are nowhere near the trend, which means the incomes are nowhere near just the 2010s trend, let alone the pre-2008 trend, which means that we don't have incomes, we don't have output, we don't have goods and services. We are falling behind. In one of her few moments of clarity, former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen, early on in her tenure, admitted that, yeah, this is exactly what's happening. She told Congress that when we see diminished labor force participation among prime age men and women, that suggests something that is not just demographic, because we do have demographic factors to consider. And so my personal view is that a portion of the decline in labor force participation we have seen is a kind of hidden slack or unemployment. Not just a portion, a huge portion. These workers have fallen out of the labor force, and they're considered not workers anymore. They're just scrubbed from history. They're removed from the official unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate goes lower and lower. Meanwhile, the amount of work available in the economy is not reflected by that unemployment rate. It is reflected by GDP per capita or by these other numbers when we compare them to their trends, the necessary trends that we need to keep going back to. Recovery. That never happens. The consequences, like the measurements, are not strictly economic. We can see this in other ways, though we do need to be careful about confusing causation and correlation. But there's other factors involved in some of these other angles on living standards too. I'm talking about, for example, drug overdose deaths. We see from the CDC data that there is a noticeable uptick, especially among men, especially among men of working age, after 2008 and 2009. It really 2012 and moving forward through the 2010s, suddenly drug overdose deaths start to really surge. Is that because of societal factors or social issues? Well, sure, absolutely. But those societal factors and social issues may be amplified by the economic decay, by the degradation of living standards, the lack of work. We also see the impact in lower birth rates. Now, obviously, low birth rates have been falling for a very long time, especially through the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. But according to the CDC's data, birth rates had been declining at a relatively stable and low rate throughout the 1990s into the 2000s. Their birth rates were about 14.6 in 1995, 14.4 in 2000, still 14 in 2005, so down about half a point from 95 to 2005, but then it starts to accelerate 2009 and forward. 2009, you're at 13.5, but 2015, 12.4, and 2019, 11.4. Again, there are other factors to consider, social issues and whatnot, but the weak economy, the degradation in living standards has likely played a strong role in more than just economic outcomes. And of course, through all of this, the stock market, really going back to around 2011, 2012, has been booming, absolutely booming. Over the last year or so, continued to boom. So stock market and the financial economy doing really well, while the real economy gets worse and worse and worse, which only leads to more social and political problems down the road. If you're benefiting from the stock market or speculating in cryptocurrencies, more power to you. That's not the issue here. Is that there's a fundamental rift we're not allowed to appreciate. That fundamental rift between how the economy is actually doing and our perception of it being driven by factors that are completely unrelated. So the inequality issue is really, again, about living standards. The economy doesn't work for most people. And it doesn't work enough to the point that we leave too many workers, potential workers, outside of it. And yet, despite all of this data, officials, they don't ever refer to it. They don't ever give you the full context for GDP or employment. They just tell you, hey, the last payroll report looked pretty good. The rate of change was relatively high. They don't tell you how far behind the trend we are. Just today, Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller said, with the labor market as strong as it is, my focus remains bringing inflation down toward the FOMC's 2% goal. The latest CPI data was reassuring that inflation is not accelerating, and data on spending and labor markets suggests to me that a monetary policy is at an appropriate setting to put downward pressure on inflation. What crap! What are these people talking about? What they're talking about is not talking about the truth. We don't want to talk about the degradation of living standards because then you might start pointing fingers in their direction. When did all of this start to arise? 2008. What happened in 2008? It wasn't a financial breakdown. It was a monetary one. Once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. So living standards have been decaying, and we've got numbers for this. Over the last 17 years, and no one has been told about any of this. We keep focusing on the latest quarterly growth rate for GDP or the latest monthly payroll report. Never mind the actual relationship to the trend, which actually matters far more than anything, especially how these trends break in 2008. Can you imagine the world with $4 trillion more in income available to the entire economy? It would be a much better place. It would be more like what we might remember, for those of us my age, of the 1990s. Actual legitimate boom, not the crap that they tell you today about a strong economy. So why can't we have that? We're not even allowed to ask that question because according to every official bozo, the economy is absolutely strong and you have them to thank for it. The labor market is absolutely robust. The fuck it is. It's gotten to the point where even the mainstream media has to make excuses for why most people don't feel the economy's all that great. They call it a vibe session. I talked about that in the video link below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and Eurodollar University subscribers. Until next time, take care.